She lay freezing on a bench, whispering, "Daddy, is that you?" And the millionaire CEO's life changed forever. The city was wrapped in a heavy blanket of snow, the kind that silenced even the busiest streets and made the lamps glow with a hazy halo. It was the kind of night when people rushed home faster than usual, eager to escape the wind that cut through layers of clothing and the ice that crept under collars and sleeves. In the corner of a small park, near the iron benches that were usually filled with children in the warmer months, a figure lay curled up. It was not an old man or a wanderer, but a child. A girl, no more than 5 years old, with golden hair tangled from the wind, and cheeks pale from the cold, had made the hard wooden bench her bed. She wore a thin jacket, its zipper broken and edges frayed, and her little boots were worn, one strap hanging loose, both offering no warmth against the biting air. She had pulled her knees close to her chest, as though by shrinking herself she could hide from the winter itself. When the tall man in the light blue suit walked past, he almost missed her at first, so still and small she looked, like a forgotten doll left out in the snow. He was lost in thought about business deals, contracts, and the endless meetings of his life, but then his eyes caught the slight movement of her head turning. She looked up at him with eyes that seemed far too big for her face, wide, glassy, and filled with something between hope and delirium. Her lips trembled as she whispered words that made him freeze in place. "Daddy. Is that you? I'm so cold." Her voice was weak, as though every syllable cost her the last scraps of strength she had. The man, Michael Wilson, a name spoken with respect and fear in boardrooms across the city, felt his composure shatter in that instant. He had built a career on numbers, strategies, and power, but none of that prepared him for the sight of this fragile little girl who mistook him for someone she desperately needed. Her head fell back onto the bench, her eyes closing as if surrendering to the icy night. Michael's chest tightened, and he suddenly forgot about everything else. He was not a businessman at that moment, nor the unshakable CEO who commanded entire corporations. He was simply a human being, staring at the small body of a child who might not survive the night if he did nothing. The snow swirled around them, and Michael dropped to his knees beside the bench. He could see her lips turning blue, her tiny hands raw from the cold. For the first time in years, he felt fear, not the fear of failure or loss in business, but the fear of losing something irreplaceable before it even had a chance to live. Without a second thought, he scooped her into his arms, the weight of her frighteningly light, as though she had not eaten properly in days. He pulled his coat tighter around her, pressing her against his chest, feeling her trembling seep into his bones. As he carried her toward his car, he could still hear the faint echo of her words in his mind. She had called him "Daddy." And though he knew it was a mistake, a desperate illusion of a child on the edge of unconsciousness, the word pierced his heart with an unfamiliar ache. For the first time in years, Michael Wilson was not thinking about where he was going or what tomorrow would bring. All that mattered now was getting this little girl warm, safe, and alive. The drive to the hospital felt like the longest Michael had ever endured, though the streets were nearly empty and his driver sped through the snow as if the icy roads no longer mattered. The little girl lay in his arms in the back seat, her head resting against his chest, and every few moments he would glance down to see if her small chest still rose and fell. She looked even smaller now, swallowed in his coat, her blonde hair damp from melted snow, her lashes sticking together as her eyes remained closed. Her fingers, cold and rigid, clutched at the fabric of his suit as though her body instinctively sought to hold on to warmth. He whispered words he didn't realize were leaving his mouth, quiet assurances to a child who could not hear him. "You're safe now, little one. I won't let you go. Just stay with me." When they arrived, the bright lights of the emergency entrance stung his eyes, but they also felt like hope. Nurses rushed forward as soon as they saw him step out, carrying her carefully in his arms. Michael spoke with a calmness that came from years of authority, yet his voice shook in ways he had never allowed it to before. She was outside, in the snow. She needs help immediately. Please. The staff did not hesitate, they took her from him and disappeared through the double doors, leaving him standing in the hallway with his coat still open, his chest suddenly cold where her fragile warmth had been. For a moment, the silence pressed down on him, and he realized his hands were trembling, his heart pounding as though he had just lived through something that could have broken him. He followed after them, ignoring the protests from the receptionist about waiting. Power had taught him to move through obstacles without permission, and this time it was not pride that pushed him forward but desperation. He stopped when he reached the glass window of the room they had placed her in. Doctors worked quickly, warming her with heated blankets, checking her vitals, setting up 4 lines. Her small body looked even more fragile under the hospital lights, so fragile that it seemed wrong for a child to be lying in a place meant for the sick and dying. Michael pressed a hand to the glass, not caring if anyone saw the pain in his face. He had no idea who this little girl was, where she came from, or why she was alone in such brutal cold, but he knew one thing with certainty: she had been left behind, and if he had not found her, she would not have lived until morning. Hours passed, though they felt like moments stretched into eternity. He sat in a chair outside her room, refusing to leave, the weight of her words replaying again and again in his mind. "Daddy? Is that you?" He closed his eyes and let out a breath that sounded more like a plea than anything else. Michael had never been a father, his life had never allowed space for such responsibility. His relationships had been shallow, his heart guarded, and he had believed that the world was too cruel for him to bring children into it. Yet the idea of being mistaken for a father by this little girl, the way her fragile voice had carried that word into the frozen night, struck something inside him that had been locked away for years. It unsettled him, shook him, but it also awakened a part of himself he had not known was still alive. When the doctor finally came out, Michael rose immediately, his broad shoulders stiff, his expression sharp, but his voice softer than anyone in his company had ever heard it. "How is she?" The doctor gave him a look filled with both exhaustion and reassurance. "She's stable now. Severe hypothermia and malnutrition, but she's responding well to treatment. She'll need time, care, and proper nutrition. She hasn't been looked after for a long time." The word stabbed Michael deeper than he wanted to admit. A child of 5 or 6 should have been in a warm bed, surrounded by love, not abandoned on a frozen bench in a park. Michael looked through the glass again at the child now resting more peacefully under the blankets. For the first time in years, his thoughts were not of balance sheets, contracts, or mergers, but of something entirely different: responsibility. He had found her, yes, but the question that echoed inside him was what would happen to her now. Would she be left to the system, shuffled from one faceless home to another, forgotten until she was old enough to forget how it felt to belong? The thought sickened him. He clenched his fists and knew, even without saying it aloud, that he could not let that happen. Something had begun the moment she looked at him and called him father, and it was not something he could walk away from. As the snowstorm raged outside and the city slept, Michael sat in that sterile hallway, his expensive suit wrinkled, his polished shoes scuffed with slush, yet none of it mattered. He was a man who had spent his life building empires, but tonight, for reasons he could not explain, the only empire that mattered was the fragile heartbeat of a child who had been left to freeze in the dark. And for the first time in years, he prayed silently, not for himself, not for his success, but for her, to wake, to live, and to never feel abandoned again. The following morning, Michael woke from an uncomfortable sleep in the stiff hospital chair, his neck aching from the way he had leaned against the wall through the night. The hum of machines and the faint antiseptic smell reminded him where he was before his eyes fully opened. His first thought was of the little girl. Rising quickly, he stepped to the window of her room, pressing his hand lightly against the glass as if the touch could bridge the distance. She was still there, bundled under layers of blankets, her small face paler than seemed fair for a child her age, but she was alive, and that was all that mattered. A nurse entered quietly, checking her vitals, and Michael caught himself holding his breath as if every flicker of the monitor was tied to his own chest. When the nurse came out, he asked questions that seemed almost frantic, though he tried to maintain the calm composure he was known for in boardrooms. How had she slept? Did she eat? Was she waking soon? The nurse gave him a small smile, the kind reserved for someone who cared more than they were willing to admit. She's resting well. We gave her fluids and something warm once she stirred during the night. She's weak, but she's strong, too. Children often surprise us. Michael only nodded, his jaw tightening, his heart refusing to believe she would truly be all right until he heard her voice again. Hours later, he finally got what he had been waiting for. The little girl stirred, her eyes opening slowly, blinking against the harsh lights. She looked disoriented at first, her fragile body still fighting the exhaustion that clung to her. Michael asked the staff if he could enter, and when they allowed it, he stepped inside with more hesitation than he had ever shown in his life. For a man who had negotiated billion-dollar deals without flinching, the sight of a child half hidden beneath hospital blankets made him feel like a giant stepping into sacred ground. He lowered himself into the chair beside her bed, careful not to startle her, his voice soft in a way that felt unfamiliar. "You're safe now. Do you remember me?" Her gaze drifted toward him, and for a moment her lips parted as though she might speak, but instead tears gathered in her eyes. Slowly, she nodded, and then in a voice barely above a whisper, she asked the same question that had haunted him since the night before. "Daddy?" The word pierced straight through him, and though logic told him to correct her, to explain that he was not her father, his mouth refused to form the words. Instead, he leaned closer, taking her tiny hand in his, the contrast of his large, warm palm and her small cold fingers stark. "I'm here," he said quietly. It was not an answer, not really, but it was all he could manage. He encouraged her to take a few sips of the broth the nurses brought, guiding the spoon carefully when her hands shook too much. Watching her eat so little but with such determination twisted something in his chest. How long had she gone without food? How many nights had she fought sleep because of hunger? Each detail was another invisible wound, and he found himself clenching his jaw, anger simmering not at her but at the world that had allowed this. When she finished a few mouthfuls, her head tilted to the side, her body too frail to hold itself up for long. Michael adjusted the blankets around her, almost awkwardly at first, but then with a growing tenderness that surprised him. As the day unfolded, Michael stayed by her side, listening when she began to speak in fragments. Her words painted a picture that was far worse than he had feared. A father who had disappeared one day, a mother who had fallen ill, and a slow descent into a life where hunger and cold were daily companions. Michael struggled to keep his emotions hidden, but when she admitted in a small trembling voice that she thought her mother might not wake up, his chest tightened until he thought it might break. "She has to wake up," she whispered. "I told her I'd be good." Her innocence, the belief that her behavior could determine whether her mother lived or died, nearly destroyed him. He placed his hand gently on her small shoulder and spoke with more conviction than he felt. "It's not your fault. Nothing you did could ever cause this. Do you understand? None of this is because of you." She looked at him with wide, uncertain eyes, as though no one had ever told her such a thing before. The silence between them was heavy, but slowly she nodded, clutching the edge of his sleeve as though afraid he might disappear if she let go. For the rest of the day, Michael did not take another call, did not check his phone, and did not once think of the meetings he was missing. His entire world had narrowed to the fragile child in the hospital bed, to the sound of her quiet breathing, and to the unspoken responsibility now resting on his shoulders. He could feel the shift happening inside him, subtle but undeniable, as though life itself had drawn a line between the man he had been and the man he was becoming. That night, As the hospital grew quieter and the city lights flickered beyond the windows, Michael sat in the chair beside her, watching her sleep once more. Her hand still clung to his even in her dreams, and he made no move to pull away. He realized then that it was not just compassion holding him there but something deeper, something binding. Whether fate or accident had placed her in his path, he knew with certainty that he could not walk away. Not now. Not ever. And in the silence of that hospital room, Michael understood that his life had changed forever, though he had only just begun to see how. The winter sun filtered weakly through the tall hospital windows, spilling pale light across the polished floors as Michael walked down the hallway toward Emily's room. The faint sound of machines, nurses' footsteps, and distant murmurs of families waiting outside doors filled the air, but his mind was consumed with only one thing: the little girl who had begun to change everything he thought he knew about himself. He carried a small stuffed bear in his hand, something he had purchased early that morning when he realized she had nothing of her own in the sterile hospital room. For a man who never set foot in a toy store, it felt strange and almost humbling to stand in line surrounded by parents buying gifts for their children. Yet for him, this single bear represented more than a gift, it was an offering, a symbol of care he had not thought himself capable of before meeting her. When he stepped inside, Emily was awake, her small frame propped up by pillows, her blonde braids tangled from restless sleep. Her blue eyes lifted toward him, hesitant but curious, and she gave him the faintest smile. He felt something unclench in his chest. He placed the bear on her lap, and for the first time, he saw her eyes widen with genuine surprise. She ran her small fingers across the soft fabric as though afraid it would vanish if she touched it too hard. "Is it for me?" she asked softly, her voice cracking with disbelief. Michael crouched down beside her bed so his gaze was level with hers, and he nodded. "Yes. He's yours. You can name him anything you want." She hugged the bear tightly against her chest and whispered, "I'll call him Hope." The word lingered in the room, almost too heavy for such a small child to carry, yet it felt right. The day passed with moments that would have seemed ordinary to anyone else but struck Michael as extraordinary. He read stories to her from a children's book the nurse had found, stumbling awkwardly through the voices of different characters while Emily laughed quietly, a sound he realized he had not heard from her before. He helped her color with crayons when her hands trembled too much to hold them steady, his large hand guiding hers until a shaky rainbow appeared across the page. And when the nurse brought her soup, he encouraged her with patient words, watching every spoonful as though her appetite itself was a victory. Each moment drew him deeper, and though he tried to convince himself he was simply doing what anyone with decency would do, a truth was taking root in his heart. He was beginning to see her not as a stranger's child but as his own. Later that afternoon, Emily asked a question that froze him where he sat. She looked at him with those piercing blue eyes, her small hand clutching his sleeve, and whispered, "Will you leave me too?" The weight of her words pressed down like a stone. Michael swallowed hard, his mind racing with answers that seemed inadequate. He had spent his entire life avoiding commitments that tied him too closely to anyone, but now, looking into the eyes of a child who had known abandonment more times than love, he found he couldn't lie. He leaned forward, speaking with a conviction that startled even himself. "No, Emily. I won't leave you. Not now, not ever." She searched his face for a long moment, as though testing whether she could trust those words, and then, for the first time, she laid her head against his arm and drifted into sleep. That night, as the sky outside turned dark and snowflakes began to fall against the glass, Michael remained by her side. His phone buzzed with calls he ignored, his assistant left messages about urgent meetings he would not attend, and investors demanded answers he no longer cared to provide. All of that could wait. The empire he had built suddenly felt insignificant compared to the fragile trust of one child. Sitting there in the dim hospital room, with her small hand wrapped around his sleeve and her stuffed bear nestled under her chin, Michael realized he was being given something he had never dared to ask for, a second chance at family, at love, at becoming the kind of man he had always avoided being. As the clock crept toward midnight, Michael allowed himself a quiet confession he spoke only to the silence. "You're not alone anymore, Emily. You'll never be alone again." And though she was asleep, her breathing slow and even, he felt as if she heard him, as if the promise had already taken root not just in his heart but in hers as well. The man who had always prided himself on strength and control now understood that true strength was not found in the boardroom or in the wealth he had accumulated, but in the simple act of holding on to a child who had nothing, and choosing to never let go. The morning began with a pale winter light that barely managed to filter through the heavy curtains of the hospital room, and Michael sat slouched in a chair beside Emily's bed, his eyes heavy from a night without sleep. He had refused to leave her side, even when the nurses assured him that she would be safe, and his body ached from the stiffness of the chair, yet he felt an unusual peace in the quiet rhythm of her breathing. Emily stirred awake slowly, clutching the stuffed bear she had named Hope, her braids tangled and her small face pale but no longer shadowed by the same deep exhaustion. When her eyes found him, sitting exactly where he had been the night before, she whispered softly, almost afraid to break the silence, "You stayed." The words cut into him in a way he didn't expect, a reminder that she had learned to expect people to disappear. He leaned forward, brushing a stray strand of hair from her forehead, and answered with a voice that carried a weight he had never felt before, "I told you, I'm not going anywhere." The day unfolded with small but powerful moments that stitched themselves into his heart. Michael had arranged for a tray of breakfast to be brought up, nothing extravagant, just scrambled eggs, toast, and fruit, but when Emily saw it, her eyes widened as if it were a feast. She ate slowly, savoring each bite, and he realized how foreign the idea of a warm, consistent meal must have been to her. Watching her, Michael felt a pang of shame for the years he had spent indulging in excess, wasting food at lavish dinners, while a child like her had gone hungry. After breakfast, she asked him to help her write the note she had wanted to give her mother, a request that brought back the memory of their first meeting. He took the pencil into his large hand and helped her shape the letters, her tiny fingers pressed over his as they spelled out the words together, "Mommy, please wake up soon. I love you." By the time they finished, the paper was slightly smudged with graphite and a trace of her small tears, but to Michael, it was the most important letter he had ever helped write. Later in the afternoon, a doctor came into the room to discuss Emily's situation, and Michael listened carefully, his expression hardening as he learned just how precarious things had been for her. Malnutrition, stress, and the trauma of abandonment had left their marks. She needed stability, proper care, and above all, safety. The doctor's words underscored something Michael already knew deep down: she could not go back to the life she had come from. As the conversation ended, Emily reached for his hand, holding on to him with a quiet desperation that felt like both a plea and a promise. In that moment, Michael understood with terrifying clarity that he was no longer simply a bystander in her story, he was now a part of it, woven into the fragile threads of her survival. When evening came, Michael decided to take Emily on a short walk down the hospital corridor. She was weak, but she insisted on trying, clutching hope in one arm and his hand in the other. As they moved slowly past the other rooms, nurses smiled, some whispering to each other about the powerful businessman who now looked more like a father than a CEO. Emily paused by a window that overlooked the city, the snow falling gently under the glow of the streetlights, and she pressed her forehead to the glass. "It's pretty," she murmured, and then, with a child's innocence that cut straight to his heart, she added, "Do you think Mommy can see it too?" Michael knelt beside her, unsure of what to say, his throat tight with unspoken emotion. He placed his hand gently over hers on the window and replied softly, "I think she sees more than you know. And I think she's proud of you." That night, as Emily fell asleep once again with her bear tucked close, Michael found himself staring at her for a long time, reflecting on how drastically his world had shifted. The empire he had built now felt empty compared to the quiet responsibility of watching over this one small child. For years he had measured success in contracts signed and profits gained, but none of it mattered here in the stillness of a hospital room. What mattered now was the little girl who trusted him enough to fall asleep knowing he would still be there when she woke. For the first time in his life, Michael realized that he was not afraid of the weight of responsibility. In fact, he welcomed it, because it meant Emily would never again have to carry the weight of loneliness alone. And as he finally drifted into a light sleep in the chair beside her, he knew with absolute certainty that his life would never return to what it had been before she called him Daddy in her dream. The morning after Emily's fragile night in the hospital began with a low hum of activity in the corridors, the shuffle of nurses' shoes and the faint smell of antiseptic lingering in the air. Michael sat with his elbows on his knees, his head in his hands, exhausted but unwilling to close his eyes fully because the idea of missing even a second of her stirring worried him. When Emily finally woke, she blinked against the pale light and turned her head toward him, whispering almost as though testing the words, "You're still here." Her tone was a mixture of relief and disbelief, as if she had grown accustomed to waking up alone. He straightened, rubbed his tired eyes, and leaned closer, answering firmly but gently, "I told you, Emily, I'm not going anywhere. Not now, not ever." The look she gave him in response was something he couldn't define, a strange blend of fragile hope and fear of betrayal. Breakfast was brought in by a nurse, and while it was nothing extraordinary, porridge, toast, and a small cup of orange juice, it seemed like a treasure to Emily. She sat cross-legged in bed, carefully spooning the porridge into her mouth, as though savoring each bite in case it was her last for a while. Michael couldn't stop watching her, noticing every small mannerism, the way she held the spoon too tightly, the way her shoulders seemed to tense as though she half expected someone to yank the plate away. He found himself filled with both sorrow and anger, sorrow that she had been forced to live with so little, and anger toward the father who had left her, the world that had failed her, and himself for not having crossed her path sooner. He realized that if he had walked by her one day later, maybe she wouldn't have survived another cold night. Later in the day, a social worker arrived to speak with Michael. She was cautious, explaining procedures, paperwork, the law's requirements, the complications of guardianship. Her tone was clinical, but Michael felt the weight behind every word. Emily's future was now precariously balanced in the hands of bureaucratic systems. He listened carefully, though every instinct in him rebelled against the coldness of legal discussions when there was a child who simply needed someone to hold her hand. Emily sat on the bed clutching her bear, her wide blue eyes watching as though she knew her fate was being debated. At one point she slid off the bed, walked timidly to Michael, and slipped her small hand into his without a word. The social worker noticed, paused, and the moment hung in the air like proof stronger than any contract. Michael, squeezing her hand, declared in a voice that had silenced boardrooms and swayed markets, "I will not abandon her. Whatever needs to be done, I will do it." The finality in his tone left no room for argument. In the afternoon, Emily asked if they could go to the hospital garden. Though it was cold, Michael bundled her in a blanket and carried her outside. The garden was quiet, with patches of frost clinging to the grass and bare branches reaching into the gray sky. Emily sat on a bench, her little legs dangling, and looked at him with an intensity that startled him. "Why do you care?" she asked suddenly, her voice small but direct, as if she were bracing herself for disappointment. He crouched in front of her so they were at eye level and answered slowly, choosing each word with care. "Because sometimes life brings us people we're meant to protect, even if we don't understand why. And because no one should ever have to feel as alone as you have." For a long time she was silent, then she reached into the folds of her blanket and pulled out the crumpled note they had written together for her mother. She held it out to him and whispered, "Can you keep it safe until she wakes up?" He nodded, taking the fragile paper as though it were more valuable than any deal he had ever signed. That evening, back in her room, Emily seemed restless. She fidgeted with her bear, chewed on her lip, and finally blurted out, "If you leave, I won't have anyone." The word struck him like a blow, and he immediately sat beside her, pulling her gently into his arms. She resisted for a second, then melted against him, her small body trembling as if years of fear and longing were spilling out all at once. He stroked her hair and murmured, "I'm here, Emily. I'm not leaving." As she calmed, Michael realized this wasn't just about temporary care or temporary comfort. This was about building a promise she could believe in for the rest of her life. When she finally drifted to sleep in his arms, the hospital lights casting a soft glow around them, Michael stared out the window at the falling snow and thought of the empire he had built, the endless meetings, the cold numbers in contracts, the shallow faces of people who only saw him as power and wealth. None of it mattered compared to this small girl who clung to him like her entire world depended on his presence. He knew then that his life had changed forever. He would fight the courts, the laws, and anyone who stood in his way if it meant giving her the family she deserved. For the first time in his life, Michael understood that love, not power, was the truest measure of strength. The days following their quiet moment in the hospital garden became a whirlwind of challenges, decisions, and emotions that neither Michael nor Emily could have predicted. On the 7th day since they had met, Michael was once again seated in the hospital's sterile consultation room across from the social worker, a lawyer, and a child psychologist. The table between them was cluttered with papers, documents filled with terms like guardianship, custody, and suitability. Every page seemed to weigh 100 pounds because Michael knew they were not just legal formalities, they were the fragile scaffolding of Emily's future. He sat upright, his jaw set, his eyes fixed on the officials in the room, but inside his chest his heart hammered with a combination of resolve and fear. He had faced business acquisitions worth billions, but none of those deals had ever left his throat this dry. Through the glass wall, Emily could be seen sitting on a small chair in the waiting area. Her feet barely touched the ground, her blonde braids brushing her shoulders as she clutched the ever-present teddy bear. She seemed unaware of the magnitude of what was happening inside the room, but her gaze kept flicking toward the glass, seeking Michael's face every few minutes as if to reassure herself that he was still there. When their eyes met, Michael gave her a steady nod, and she responded with the faintest, almost imperceptible smile. It was a silent pact between them, he would fight, and she would believe. The psychologist began asking questions, some directed at Michael, others to be answered later by Emily. "Do you understand the commitment involved? Are you aware of the difficulties that may arise? Can you balance your corporate responsibilities with the needs of a child?" Each question was delivered with a professional tone, but Michael could sense the doubt beneath them, as though they were waiting for him to reveal a crack, some flaw that would disqualify him. He took his time before answering, carefully considering his words. "My company can be managed by many," he finally said, his voice steady, "but Emily has only one chance to be saved from a life of abandonment. My schedule, my power, my wealth, none of that matters if I cannot protect her. So yes, I understand the commitment. And I intend to see it through." Later, when Emily was brought into the room, the psychologist tried to ease her in with soft questions about school, friends, and what she liked to do for fun. Emily shifted in her chair, her small fingers gripping the fabric of her dress as she hesitated to answer. Finally, the psychologist asked, "Do you feel safe with Mr. Carter?" The room went still. Emily looked at Michael, then down at her shoes, then finally back up again. Her voice was quiet, almost a whisper, but it carried across the room with absolute clarity. "He doesn't leave me alone. He stays." For a girl who had been left behind so many times, those words carried more weight than any lawyer's argument. Michael felt his chest tighten and his throat burn, fighting to keep his composure. That evening, when the legal discussions concluded with more hearings scheduled for the following week, Michael took Emily to the hospital cafeteria. It was nearly empty, the fluorescent lights flickering slightly overhead, but to her it might as well have been a feast. He let her choose what she wanted, and she selected a small bowl of macaroni and cheese with deliberate seriousness, as though she was afraid of asking for too much. When they sat together at the plastic table, Emily pushed the bowl toward him before eating. "You can share," she said simply, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Michael took a small spoonful, his throat tightening again, realizing this child who had so little still thought first of others. After dinner, as they walked back toward her room, Emily tugged at his sleeve. "If they don't let me stay with you, will you still visit me?" The question pierced him like a knife. He crouched down, his eyes level with hers, and answered with a conviction that surprised even himself. "Emily, I will never let them take you away from me. Not again. Not ever." She studied his face with that uncanny seriousness that only a child who had seen too much of life's cruelty could have, and after a long pause, she whispered, "Okay. I believe you." That night, as she drifted to sleep, Michael sat in the chair beside her bed, the note she had written to her comatose mother still folded in his pocket. He unfolded it quietly, reading the uneven letters they had formed together. "Mommy, please wake up soon. I love you." The words were simple, but their innocence struck him harder than any polished speech he had ever heard. He realized then that he was not just fighting for Emily's present comfort, but for the future her mother would have wanted for her. It was more than guardianship, it was a sacred responsibility. As he sat there, watching her chest rise and fall in the rhythm of sleep, Michael vowed again in the silence of the hospital night that no system, no law, no shadow from the past would rob her of the family she deserved. In that moment, he felt the enormity of love turn into something even stronger, a promise sealed not with words, but with every beat of his heart. The morning of the final custody hearing arrived like a storm, heavy and relentless, carrying with it the weight of every sleepless night Michael had endured since the day he had first seen Emily in the hospital corridor. The courtroom was colder than he expected, its white walls unforgiving, its wooden benches filled with people whose expressions betrayed curiosity, skepticism, or simply indifference. At the front sat the judge, a woman with sharp eyes that seemed to pierce through every word, every gesture. Beside Michael, Emily's small hand clutched at his sleeve as if letting go meant the world would fall apart. She wore a simple pink dress and her blonde hair had been tied into neat braids that morning. Those strands had already come loose, framing her face in a way that made her look even more vulnerable. The opposing lawyer tried to paint a picture of Michael as a man too powerful and too busy to care for a child, a man who could easily buy companionship but not understand true devotion. They brought up his corporate responsibilities, his late nights in offices filled with glass and steel, and his reputation for ruthlessness in business. Each accusation landed in the room like a hammer, but Michael remained silent, waiting for his turn, knowing that rage or defensiveness would do nothing to help the little girl whose hand was still trembling in his. When it was finally his chance to speak, he stood, adjusted his suit jacket, and took a breath that seemed to gather not just air but the very essence of his resolve. He did not speak like a businessman addressing shareholders, he spoke like a man who had found his soul tethered to a fragile life. He told the story of how he had first seen Emily, alone and broken, trying to communicate with her mother through a letter she could not even write herself. He spoke of her resilience in the face of loss, her quiet bravery, and her capacity to offer kindness even when she had nothing. He confessed openly that she had taught him more about humanity in a matter of weeks than he had learned in decades of boardrooms and contracts. His voice broke once, when he said, "I may have built skyscrapers, but Emily built a home in my heart." The silence in the courtroom was thick after that, and for the first time since the proceedings began, Michael felt the tide shift. The judge asked Emily if she wanted to say anything. Everyone expected her to shrink away, too shy or too frightened to speak in front of so many adults. Instead, she stood, still holding Michael's hand, and looked up at the bench with eyes that shimmered with a quiet strength. Her words were small, yet powerful. He stayed. Everyone else left, but he stayed. I want to stay with him. The words cut through the formality of the court like a beam of light, so raw and pure that they left no space for doubt. Even the judge's stern expression softened, though she quickly masked it again. After a long pause, the ruling was announced. Custody was granted to Michael Carter. The words reverberated in the air like a release of tension that had been suffocating them for weeks. Michael exhaled, a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, and looked down at Emily. She blinked up at him, her eyes wide, then broke into a smile so radiant it seemed to light the entire room. He crouched and pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly as she whispered against his chest, "We did it." That evening, they returned not to a sterile hospital or a temporary shelter, but to Michael's home, a place that until now had felt empty despite its size and luxury. For the first time, laughter echoed in the marble halls as Emily ran from room to room, her footsteps quick and light, claiming each corner as her own. Michael followed her with a smile that felt both foreign and deeply familiar, a smile born of genuine happiness rather than success. When she finally grew tired and curled up on the living room couch, her teddy bear in one hand and his hand in the other, Michael sat beside her, watching her fall asleep in the glow of the fireplace. He realized he was no longer alone, no longer defined only by his title or his wealth. He had become what he had never dared to imagine himself to be, a father. Outside, the city lights flickered like stars brought down to earth, but inside, the warmth of something far greater filled the space. It was not the triumph of a business deal or the pride of victory, but the quiet, humbling triumph of love. And as Michael leaned back, his eyes closing for the first peaceful rest in years, he knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, he and Emily would face them together. Because promises kept in the darkest moments become the strongest kind of truth, and theirs was unbreakable.